What the hell is taking him so long? I've been here for well over 2 hours.
Axle glared at the tavern's door before slamming his mug on the chipped table. Ale sloshed over the rim, coating his hand. Seething at his own blunder, Axle shook the golden droplets off of his skin and wiped whatever remained on his pant leg before reclaiming his mug. Axle was only kidding himself to believe his appearance wasn't as old and unkempt as the Bedshaker Brewery. The furniture was scuffed, scraped, and chipped, with years of use. The walls were battered, tapestries moth-eaten, and mystery stains were imprinted on the floor that many chose to avoid stepping on for superstitious reasons. Alcohol, sweat, and rotting wood lingered in the air no matter how many candles burned. The only feature that looked well cared for in the room was the bar, the establishment's saving grace. The tavern's bar was occupied by a variety of drunkards, drained workmen, and couples who had the barmaiden working without pause. In his 3-hour wait, Axle had nothing to do but surmise the poor existence he assumed the bar's occupants had. His gaze swept past the couples getting handsy and laughing and settled on one cloaked individual seated at the bar's end. Axle hadn't been able to make any deductions about this individual. All he could gather was that the stranger was younger than himself. Despite Axle's curiosity, someone sitting at the bar not drinking whatever they had ordered was odd, but otherwise didn't matter. A few of the tavern's tables were filled with guests, and one in particular was drawing a small crowd. A serpent-folk woman with mischief in her cold, reptilian eyes sat before a group of 4 shuffling a deck of cards. She conversed with them while wearing a sly grin on her face. Axle scoffed at the sight of the elaborate tarot cards she shuffled. He was never one for cheesy fortunes that were too vague to understand, nor did he care for the idea of someone relying on decorated sheets of paper for guidance. The people crowded around her were complete fools. He watched as she proceeded to lay a few cards face down on the table before setting the rest of the deck aside to pull her long, dark braid forward to lay over her shoulder. She flipped the first card face up, and observers' faces twisted in either glee or frustration. As she flipped the remaining cards, the growing smirk on her face unsettled Axle. Flipping the last card over, her expression morphed into confusion until she noticed Axle watching her. Playing coy, Axle turned back to his mug, yet not before catching sight of her sly grin that made him shudder. No longer interested in the woman's scheme, he took 3 large chugs of his ale before setting his mug back on the table. Tipping it forward, his yellowed reflection frowned up at him from the quarter of brew left. With a tight grip around the iron handle, he threw back the last of his ale and slid the empty mug over to join the other 3 in mourning. Axle reached for the 5th mug he had ordered in advance. Another night would be wasted waiting for Idomo to arrive with nothing new to tell him about his wife's case. Yet he continued to hope for new leads and continued to drown his grief and countless regrets in ale.
When the hell is Idomo going to...
Ale dribbled from Axel's lips as the tavern's door slammed open with a force that made the whole building quake. He wiped the ale with his stained sleeve before turning to the tavern's entrance. Axel blinked as he took in the newcomer's appearance.
I think I've reached my limit of ale.
The newcomer was a child, maybe a little over 4 feet in height. It had fluffy pink hair that really needed to be combed. Her blue scaled skin shimmered just a bit from the glow of the candles as she marched inside, and the sharp fins along her forearms, calves, and ears were almost translucent. A box-shaped fish trailed behind her in a sphere of floating water. Axel would have mistaken the water sphere for a floating crystal ball in his buzzed stupor if not for the fish swimming within it. The intimidating golden trident sheathed on her back unsettled Axel and the other tavern patrons watching. Her leather armor and cape were embellished with foreign designs that most wouldn't recognize, but Axel had come across those oceanic depictions a handful of times in his years of studying, but he never imagined he'd see someone like her on land.
A sea dweller? Here?
She appeared to be unfazed or oblivious to the attention she was attracting from many of the tavern's patrons as she strolled by. After reaching the request board hanging on the tavern's back wall, she stopped, placed her hands on her hips, and began to scan the various parchments nailed to it. Axel gazed at her in befuddlement as she conversed with the fish floating by her shoulder in a tongue that sounded like gurgling water in a brook.
I'm probably just hallucinating again.
He placed his hand on his thigh, chanted under his breath, and sent a small shock of lightning through his body. He jolted in his chair as the spell coursed through his leg. Holding back an audible curse, Axel rubbed the spot where he had shocked himself and looked back toward the request board. To his dismay, the strange newcomer was still standing there.
What in the hell is a young sea dweller doing here on the surface?
Out of his peripheral vision, Axel noticed a heavy-set, drunk man almost twice her height, beginning to stagger over to her with a tankard sloshing over with brew.
Hello, young lady.
He slurred as his shadow fell over her. Paternal alarm spiked in Axel's heart as he stood and began to make his way toward the back of the tavern without a second thought. She turned to look behind her, and her gaze traveled up to meet the sloppy grin on the drunkard's face. "Hi, mister," the sea dweller said in common tongue.
What's your name?
He asked with a grin. "Oh, I'm Forlorn, and this is my friend Bubbles." She held her fish companion up like a child would a prized toy. The man looked taken aback by the radiance of her energy and by the fish that stared at him in judgmental silence.
Oh, see. You two certainly ain't from around here, are ya?
"Nope, we're from the ocean." Axel leaned against a wood beam to listen and watch over the conversation from nearby in case he needed to intervene.
Well, what was you looking for?
The drunkard asked, gesturing to the request board with his mug. The action sloshed ale over one of the posted parchments. The drenched request fell to the floor in a wet lump. "Well, we were looking for a job that involved a fight or some monster hunting, but none of these jobs had anything." Forlorn pouted, looking over the parchments again and pushing the wet one beneath the board with her bare webbed foot.
Oh, you're looking for a brawl, eh?
He asked, a smirk crossing his face. She nodded a few times, and her eagerness caused the man to chuckle.
I think I know just how to help.
"Really? You know where we can find a fight?"
Of course.
He sneered.
Right this way, little miss.
Axel looked ahead and saw that the drunkard was leading her towards a secluded corner in the tavern that most occupants never cared to venture near. Axel changed his position so the drunk and Forlorn would have to pass by him. He leaned against another beam, and as the unsuspecting drunkard began to pass him, Axel moved his foot a couple of inches, and the drunkard fell flat on the floor, spilling the contents of his mug.
Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there. My sight just keeps getting worse by the day. I guess age does that.
Axel watched in increasing concern as the drunkard hoisted himself to his feet and stared him down with a sharp leer of anger.
Right?
Maybe his ploy could have been planned better, but Axel had always thought himself muscular for his age. He could put up a fair fight, but not against someone who could snap him in half faster than he could snap a quill.
Did you just trip me?
While the tavern's din didn't cease, the scene had attracted more attention than Forlorn's entrance. Those at the bar and the nearby tables looked on to see what would happen.
Well, not on purpose, sir. You see, as an older gentleman, my sight is just...
Before Axel could finish, he watched the drunkard bring up a fist. Forlorn barreled into the drunkard's side and sent him fumbling back into another table. As he went down, the rickety table and its contents went with him, coating him in ale and unfinished meals. The group that had been seated there shot up and moved out of the pissed-off drunk's way as he wobbly sat up. He snarled at Forlorn and threw his mug in Axel's direction, which he ducked to avoid as it shattered on the post behind him. The enraged drunkard then withdrew a dagger from his side sheath and rushed toward his young attacker. To Axel's horror, she didn't move out of his way, but shifted her position and stood her ground. There was no time for him to intercept, but the drunk only managed to take a few charging steps forward before Forlorn darted at him again. With another powerful ram, she sent him to the floor where he flailed like an upturned beetle. A swift movement from above caught the drunk's attention, and he cried out in pain as Forlorn's trident pierced his right side about 2 inches deep. Alarm rippled through the tavern, and anyone close by vacated the immediate area out of fear of getting involved. Axel stared in bewilderment at Forlorn, who had the drunkard pinned to the floor in a matter of seconds. A child had just taken down a man twice her height with ease and had stabbed him without hesitation. And all the while, her fish companion had remained by her side.
You crazy little...
You should be more respectful of your elders, she quipped with a glare. He went to swing at her with his dagger, but not before Axel retaliated with a ball of fire aimed at the man's hand. The dagger was knocked out of the drunkard's grip as the flames licked his fingers. Ignoring the drunkard's cry, Forlorn turned to Axel and smiled at him. But she was violently shoved off the drunkard as he made a clumsy break for the back door.
Oh, are you okay?
An accented voice asked. A young man with his cloak hood up kneeled beside Forlorn as she rubbed the arm she had landed on. Axel recognized him as the stranger that was sitting at the end of the bar earlier. The young man's accent seemed to be from Augur, a massive port city on the eastern coast of the known world. Yeah, I'm good. That was a really cool spell, mister. Forlorn smiled at Axel again before getting back onto her webbed feet. She leaned against her weapon and stared at him in wonder. Axel's forgotten pride began to resurface.
Thank you. It's actually a really simple...
Can you do other magic stuff? I appreciate the help, but I could have handled that. By the way, you look like an old crippled deckhand who gets seasick in puddles. Maybe you should see a cleric or something. Oh, wait, I almost forgot. She looked around for a moment while Axel processed what he had heard in exasperated speechlessness. After a brief second of collecting himself, he glared down at Forlorn.
Listen, do you have any idea what you could have...
He's getting away! Forlorn cried as she sheathed her trident and grabbed the young man's wrist.
Wait, what are you... Ah!
The young man was pulled along as Forlorn and her fish raced out the back door.
Wait,
Axle called.
where are you going?
Neither Forlorn nor the innocent stranger replied. Axle groaned, dragging his hand over his face, and sighed as he approached the back doorway.
Sorry about the mess.
He hollered to the barmaiden. He slammed the back door behind him and looked around. Axle was quick to notice the blood droplets heading off to his right. He followed the trail, hoping to find Forlorn and whoever she took with her at the end of it. The evening sun had sunk into the horizon, and the arcane street lamps were beginning to ignite on their own as night came upon Blackpool. The trail of blood Axle had been following was beginning to disappear, and he was growing worried he wasn't going to catch up to Forlorn and her captive. Panting, he prayed that he'd find the sea dweller and the young man soon before they found the wounded drunk, and pushed himself to keep moving. The alley he was traveling down soon opened up, and Axle found himself in the central plaza of Blackpool's residential district. The open area was cobblestone and bare, though a fog was beginning to settle in. A great fountain sat in the square center. Water flowed beneath the marbled feet of a robed figure with dragon-like features who held a staff in his left clawed hand. He stood as though he were leading an army into battle, while water collected in the basin below him.
Oh, gods. Why here?
Axle glowered at the statue as he bent over to catch his breath and was relieved when he spotted Forlorn and her captive beside the fountain.
Please, don't do that again.
The young man wheezed, bent over the side of the fountain as he struggled to catch his breath.
How do you run so fast?
Forlorn looked around and huffed. We lost him. Dang it. I don't think we'll be able to find him now, especially with this fog settling in. Hey, isn't that the guy from the tavern? She and the young man looked in Axle's direction, and he gave them a little wave before straightening up. He approached the fountain and looked the young man over. His hood had slipped off while being dragged along, and his short hair nearly matched Forlorn's with its pink hue. Aside from his hair, he had round eyes, one green and one brown, and he wore simple travel attire beneath his umber cloak. He nursed the wrist he had been dragged along by as if it had been trapped in a vice, despite it looking fine to Axle. How come you were following us? Forlorn questioned.
To make sure you weren't going to get yourselves into more trouble, and to see if you were all right.
Thanks, but we're fine.
I could be a little better.
Looks to me like you've all found each other.
A new voice commented. Jumping out of his skin, Axle whipped around to see the serpent folk woman with the tarot deck from the tavern.
What are you doing here?
Axle demanded. She smirked at him and a tarot card flipped between her fingers.
I was having a little fun performing some divinations back at the Bedshaker Brewery, and was rather surprised when I drew this card in particular.
Axle recognized the card to be the outsider, and he rolled his eyes.
Naturally, I grew rather curious about the idea of a new opportunity, or a new individual with a more quality taste than my last meal. But I am content to say that I believe that little event back at the tavern was what the outsider was guiding me toward. So, I decided to follow you to see what else may happen.
After slipping the card back into her deck, the woman bowed in greeting.
My name is Kira, by the way.
You'll have to forgive me, but I'm not feeling as obliged to reciprocate formalities.
Axle retorted.
Very well, but I'm aware that you were watching me back at the tavern. Something catch your eye, perhaps?
Did you just say that You eat people?
The young man asked as he still struggled to catch his breath. Kira looked at him with a thoughtful expression.
In my culture, weak young men like you would serve as an easy hunt and an excellent breakfast. So may I advise some endurance training? I'm sure that the young lady could give you some pointers,
She said, redirecting her attention from the terrified young man to Forlorn. She gave her a little wave of acknowledgement.
Beautiful job back there, sweetie.
Thanks.
You know, I think it might be best if you left us.
Axel started. A splash of water interrupted him, and he turned to see that Forlorn had gotten into the fountain and was giving the imposing statue an inquisitive stare.
Hey, kid, you're not supposed to be in there.
Axel warned as he moved closer to the fountain's polished edge. My name's Forlorn, she retorted, her gaze still fixated on the statue. And that's Bubbles. One of her webbed fingers pointed to the fish that floated above her left shoulder in its sphere of water. The fish also seemed fixated upon the statue, but it did turn to stare at Axel as a form of introduction. He gave the fish an uncertain look before redirecting his attention to Forlorn.
The name's Axel.
He chose to ignore the hum of condescending satisfaction from Kira behind him. Great! Now that we made some introductions, can you tell me who this is? Forlorn asked. She turned to Axel over her shoulder and pointed up at the statue. A wave of disdain washed over him as he glanced up at the statue. It had been years since he'd seen it this close. The purple flame atop the dragon-like being's staff surprisingly still burned. Axel hated the idea of even speaking the statue's name, as his mind reeled with Blackpool's history. He looked to Forlorn, who gave him a firm and unrelenting stare. He sighed when he recognized that she was not going to get out of the fountain until she got what she wanted.
Yeah, that's Dresneil. He established Blackpool years before any of us were born, during the war that was plaguing the continent. He wanted to create a place for dragonfolk to sanctify and call their own. Well, he did accomplish that. The dragonfolk were more or less slaves and pawns under his rule. He was a ruthless dictator that was eventually defeated, declaring the war over. Despite his treacherous and horrible history, he did establish the city. That's why we have a statue of him.
I heard from some of the locals that there's a curse said to be on it.
Kira inquired from behind Axel.
Yes and no.
He strained, not wanting to give in to her question, but couldn't see a way out when Forlorn also appeared interested.
Which is part of the reason why you really shouldn't be in that fountain. Dresneil was a powerful necromancer, and it's said that due to his nature and magic, anyone who disturbs the statue will bring about curses and calamities.
So, he was like a general? Forlorn pressed, with a slight tilt of her head.
Was that the only thing she got out of what I said?
Axel sighed.
I guess if you want to look at him that way, yes.
He looks intimidating.
The young man muttered beside Axel, shrinking back a bit into his cloak. Forlorn scrutinized the statue for a moment before her gaze landed on the staff that the statue held. What's that thing?
What thing?
Axel questioned. His gaze followed her finger up to the flame atop the staff.
You've got to be kidding me.
He looked at her with a somewhat annoyed expression.
That's fire.
I know what fire is, she huffed. I mean the thing in it. It's glowing. Axel's gaze darted back to the flame that sat atop the staff and scrutinized it until he caught the faintest sight of a different glow that shimmered in the fire. Astonished, he looked to Forlorn again, then back up to the flame to confirm what he had seen.
How did she see that?
Axel stepped into the fountain and waded over to Forlorn and the statue. He had lived in Blackpool his whole life, and had passed this statue countless times, but he had never seen whatever sat nestled in the flame of Drosniel's staff.
What are you doing?
The young man stammered from the fountain's edge.
Oh, what's this about?
Kira asked. I'll get it, Forlorn announced as she selected a foothold and stepped onto it. Axle caught her shoulder before she could haul herself up onto the statue's pedestal.
Are you crazy? No one has ever disturbed this statue, let alone attempted to put out the fire.
Forlorn's gaze drifted to his hand gripping her shoulder before she looked back at him and shrugged. I'm not afraid of some surface world curse. If no one has ever disturbed the statue, then I'll be the first to do it. Axle stared at her in stunned silence. Was she serious? Even though he wasn't superstitious, he sure as hells wanted nothing to do with the dictator statue that could very well bestow curses upon whoever messed with it. Axle couldn't decide if she was brave or naive, but he concluded that she may be both. Regardless, he didn't feel comfortable having her scaling the statue for a foreign object that could be dangerous, occult, or both.
All right, how about this?
Axle started, his thoughts racing with how many ways he may die from doing this.
I'm well versed in the arcane. I'll get whatever it is in case something happens.
But... Forlorn frowned as she looked from him to the violet flame that danced above her.
I would listen to him and let him deal with it.
The young man added. His gaze darted between Kira, who he had taken a few steps away from, the statue of Drosniel, and Axle and Forlorn in the fountain. Forlorn looked between the fire and Axle once more before stepping back from the statue with a slight pout on her face. Fine. With the statue looming above him, Axle sucked in a breath, then exhaled it as he prepared himself for whatever curse or calamity he may summon. Magic spiraled around his fingers as a phantasmal hand apparated from the flesh of his palm. With a flick of his wrist, Axle's materialized hand floated up to the flame and paused short of entering the fire. His own fingers shook as he contemplated what he was about to do. If the legends about disturbing this statue were true, what sort of power would come from it to smite him? Suppressing the thought and wanting to see this through, Axle willed the hand forward into the fire and closed its fingers around the solid object in the flame. His breath hitched. He waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. When nothing happened after 20 seconds, he summoned the hand back to him with the mystery object in its grip. The hand faded back into his own, and his heart thrummed as a palm-sized, deep violet gem was placed in his hand. He stared at it in cautious wonder. Cold and familiar loneliness stared back at him from the gem's core. A sudden, yet faint, flash of violet light showed through the crystalline structure and remained there, gently pulsating. So, what is it? With his unoccupied hand, Axle drew a swirling rune above the gemstone. Sparks flittered from his fingertips, and the completed rune solidified before thrusting its way into the gem. The rune seemed to brand the stone as it glittered orange amidst the deep violet depths. Within a moment, the rune began to fade like dying embers in the gem's shadowy expanse. As it did so, information about the gem coalesced in Axle's mind. Images flashed before his mind's eye, cold and clear like a winter stream. The gemstone, its master, the war, countless deaths, the deception, its power, it all overwhelmed Axle as the images ceased to come forth. Axle's eyes widened and as much as he wanted to just drop the gem and run, he held on to it. He gazed at the statue that towered above him. Drasniel's cold, engraved eyes stared forward as ominous as ever.
This gemstone belonged to him. It was part of Drasniel's original staff.
And what does that mean?
I don't know. I've never felt power like this before, and I don't like it.
May I have a look?
Kira asked, wading through the water towards Axle and Forlorn. Her gaze remained fixated on the glowing gem, and she reached for it. But Axle pulled away and put his shoulder between her and the gem.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Axle retorted, glaring at her. They stared each other down in silence, with rigid postures. Based on what he had learned about Kira in their short time together, and what he had just learned from the gemstone, Axle knew that they weren't so different from each other. Both Kira and this gem were strange, powerful, untrustworthy, and dangerous. He had a feeling the two of them shouldn't be anywhere near the other. Forlorn and the young man gave each other wary looks, while Bubbles hovered by Forlorn's head, nibbling at her hair. Axle watched as Kira's gaze drifted to the dark crystal that sat in his palm with a foul and sultry look that filled Axle's soul with foreboding.
If you're not interested in the power you say that has, I'd love to take it off your hands.
Kira said with a smirk as she lunged for the gem. Thinking fast, Axle locked eyes with the young man and threw the gem in his direction just before Kira could secure it. The gem sailed over Forlorn's head and landed in the young man's hands despite his fearful fumbling with the crystalline rock. A moment of pride flashed across his features that he had succeeded in catching the gem. But as it pulsated in his hands, Axle recognized the fear in the young man's face that he had felt when he had held the gem and learned its history. Seeing that Axle no longer held what she wanted, Kira stalked toward the young man with maliciousness, sending the poor kid into a panic.
Don't let her get it.
Axle ordered as he moved through the water as fast as he could after Kira. Give it to me! I'm open! Forlorn called, waving her arms in the air.
Hand it over, child, or I'll...
The young man threw the gem in an arbitrary direction and backed away from Kira before she could swipe her long nails at him. Delighted by this turn of events, Kira caught the gem before it could make its full descent.
Damn it!
I'm so sorry!
The young man cried, seeing what he had done. With a victorious smirk, and much to Axle's horror, Kira wrapped her nails against the gem's surface before raising it to her lips. Her serpentine tongue wound its way across the gem's surface before she swallowed it whole. Magic surged to Axle's hand as green flames burst forth from his palm, and he threw the fire in Kira's direction as she slipped her forked tongue across her lips in satisfaction. The blast hit Kira in the chest, and her body fell limp out of the fountain. The square fell silent. Forlorn, the young man, and Axle waited with held breaths to see if Kira would move. When she didn't rise, Forlorn and Axle approached her with the shaken young man trailing close behind. They all looked down at her smoldering body, and upon seeing her, the young pink-haired man stumbled back and looked ready to be sick. Forlorn unsheathed her trident and poked Kira with the blunt end while Axle looked at her body in shock.
Shit.
The young man struggled to choke out his words in between overwhelmed gags.
Maybe she's just sleeping. Surely all you did was knock her out. I'm sure she'll be fine if we...
Forlorn sheathed her trident, and looked up at Axel.
She's dead.